All right. Well, welcome to today's town hall of our community-based funding models project. Thank you so much for choosing to be with us here today on January 19th, 2024. For those of you who've been engaging with us throughout this research project, or if this is just the first time that we're meeting you, we are so grateful for your valuable time, wisdom, and curiosity. And I know amidst everything that's happening in the world right now and in your individual worlds, that taking these few hours to be here today is a considerable investment and decision. So thank you for choosing to show up in whatever capacity you have today. Before I begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement and story about how truth and reconciliation has been woven into this project. I, as well as the core team project members of this project, are currently situated on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are part of the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of Six Nations, and many, many, many other nations recorded and unrecorded. This land was first named Tagaronto, which in Mohawk means where the trees are standing in the water. I am Jen. I use she, her pronouns. I am second generation Chinese Canadian settler. I am a mama, a partner, a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a friend. I am a struggling idealist, a recovering perfectionist, and a serial idea generator. I am the CEO of the Department of Imaginary Affairs, and I am the co-design lead of this project. As a child of immigrants, I used to hear land acknowledgements and think that the words in them didn't apply to me, because I thought I wasn't here on this land when colonization happened, or as if I wasn't actively participating in perpetuating colonization or benefiting from colonization today. Throughout this project, you may have heard me start one of our focus groups, design labs, presentations, learning sessions, with some version of this personal reconciliation journey. And during our learning sessions, I am extremely proud to have shifted the attention away from just my story to the story of members of our team. And Matthews and Selagatan both bravely shared their land acknowledgements for the first time and their reconciliation journeys in 2 of our 4 sessions. And in our model making sessions, we invited each participant to engage in reflecting on their own relationship to the land and to write their own land acknowledgement as well. This is an intentional reminder that as we imagine and design a proposed community-based funding model in Canada, that we also remember that we are living on Native land. Long before contact, the dish with one spoon covenant was the agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This dish symbolizes the bounty this land has to offer. We are intended to share from this bounty with all the people, living creatures, and land itself. We're intended to do so in a peaceful way, and we're intended to ensure that there is enough to go around. This is an intention I often reflect on, knowing how our decisions within the newcomer serving sector are often built on scarcity rather than abundance. As we continue to move into today's agenda, I'm going to take a moment to acknowledge the goals and the flow of the session, as well as offer a few care invitations to you as our participants. Through this session, we will be sharing with you a project summary, key themes of what we've heard during model making, co-design sessions, our proposed funding model, and there will be time for questions and discussion. It is a Friday afternoon on an extremely cold, wintry day, so I'd like to imagine that you are somewhere safe and warm. Our goal for this session is to give you a recap of what has happened throughout the project and share with you the proposed funding model that we have come up with. So that means that I'm going to be doing most of the talking with a little bit of support from Paulina for the first half of this session. And I invite you to get comfortable. If that means turning off your camera from now or having a warm drink nearby, please do so. I have a bowl full of Chinese lozenges and honey lemon water that I will probably need on occasion because of all the talking I'll be doing. But honestly, do what you need to do to be comfortable to absorb and listen and participate in this session. Like I said, this session will be recorded for research purposes, and we'll be publicly sharing the presentation portion as a knowledge artifact. All comments made during the facilitated discussion portion will only be accessible to our research team and used to demonstrate stakeholder responses about the proposed model. So throughout the session, you are still welcome to use the Zoom chat to connect to each other, to make comments, for anything that you think is relevant to share during the session, and you don't want to forget. We do document the chat and often find it extremely supportive to our research processes, so please don't be shy. And after the presentation portion, we will open up this space for feedback and invite you to share reactions, comments, questions, concerns, and ideas. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that there are times during today's session where there are feelings or thoughts that might be sparked around the changes we are proposing. And I want to honor those feelings. Positive or negative, we invite you to share them. Change happens and evokes different reactions from each of us. Throughout this project, we've invited participants to share their reflections from their personal and professional experiences, and now is no exception. I, for example, am full of contradictions when it comes to change. I want to get through it as fast as possible and to see the end results. But I also want to have time to build strong and sturdy relationships to get through the hard parts. And I want to know all the details, but I also want enough flexibility to respond to what emerges as we go. So as we shift into the content of this session, I want to remind you to notice where your body reacts. If you get tense, like your shoulders come up or you tighten, is that because you didn't like the sound of something? If you sit a little taller and your ears perk up, is that because you were curious? If you started to wander or get distracted, is it because you feel comfortable not knowing those details? All of these reactions are telling you something that you might want to share with us. But as always, those reactions are for you first. So only share what feels right for you. And not only will there be time at the end of this session and throughout the chat, we will also be sharing a feedback form after the session. So for things that percolate and land and you want to share next week or the next week, there's always a way to connect with us. And so as we move fully into this session, I'd like to invite you to take a minute to ground yourselves on the land and acknowledge that this session is just a teeny tiny part of your week and your world. So if it's comfortable for you to place a part of you, whatever is the lowest part of you, may that be your feet or your bum or your back, on a surface below you, and just ground your body and let yourself sink in. And then we're going to take 4 deep breaths together. That first breath is for you. The next one is for your ancestors. One is for your future. And one is for the land. Thank you so much again for being here today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paulina to share a bit of the framing for this project.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paulina Wyrzykowski, and many of you know me as the director of the Toronto South Local Immigration Partnership and Newcomer Services at the Neighborhood Group Community Services. I'm one of the Neighborhood Group Services, or more specifically, the Toronto South LIP is one of the three partners on this project, along with Social Planning Toronto and with the Department of Imaginary Affairs. You've already met Jennifer from the Department of Imaginary Affairs, and Social Planning Toronto was absolutely key to the first part of this project that Jennifer will be going over a little bit. So what I wanted to offer is just a little bit of background of why we decided to do this and why with the partners that we have. About 2.5 years back, we were approached by our main funder, IRCC, who approached 15 local immigration partnerships across the country to ask them to put together a collaborative funding model. And what that meant for them is they wanted to see if there was a way that if funds were to go to the community, was there an accountable way that those funds could be distributed and that project could be administered without necessarily as much involvement from the funder as there currently is. And I think they were sort of exploring ways to make the funding generally more accessible. For those of you who don't know, local immigration partnerships are local planning bodies that exist across the country. There's 88 of us. And what we do is we bring together different stakeholders who work with newcomers. And we look at the ways that the system that provides services to newcomers could be improved. So we look, we promote collaboration. We look for ways that we can address gaps in policy and in services. And we look for ways to bring people together so that newcomers who arrive in this country, no matter who they are, encounter a welcoming community. So out of those 88 LIPs, 15 were selected by our funder for this project. Now, within that main theme, we still had the option of focusing on what we wanted to focus on. And the Toronto South Local Immigration Partnership has long worked on issues of discrimination and accessibility, and a lot of the intersectionalities that now, according to the government description, fall under gender-based analysis plus. So we decided, we knew from our partners that historically, decision-making around funding has been primarily funder-driven in the newcomer services sphere. And where input was offered to the funder and where decision-making was sort of involved the community a little bit more, often the feeling was that larger organizations carried more weight and that the funding was easier to administer through large organizations. And what we wanted to do is what would happen? How could we create a model that enabled newcomers themselves and smaller agencies, especially those led by racialized members of racialized communities, grassroots groups? How could we make that funding more accessible, but specifically decision-making around funding more accessible to them? How could we augment their voices in the process, both in the funding side and then on the service delivery side? So it's an awkward way of explaining, a big goal. But that's basically what our project was about. We were trying to design this new model, this blue sky model of how could we make things more equitable for smaller grassroots organizations, often led by racialized communities and for newcomers themselves. So they have input into this process. And that's the model that we're hoping to present you with today. Now, what I want to emphasize is that there was never an indication from our funder that this would ever be implemented. My intuition from the beginning was that they wanted sort of this as a means of examining their current funding model for weaknesses and looking how things could be improved within the current funding model. So that was our starting assumption, is that we're not, we don't expect that IRCC will turn around and this is how they will do things from now on. But we expect to use some of our findings to push for change of the system that exists. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Jen for the next while. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paulina, for that framing and that history. So this project is inherently framed as a systems level research project where we are tasked to imagine a community-based funding model, and that quickly can get lost in, but why, but how? And so for me, this research project was really an opportunity for us to lead a research project using a co-design process which purposefully and intentionally focused on building relationships between stakeholders and working to address how power and resource distribution impacts the newcomer serving sector. So how did we do that? So like Paulina said, this project began in November 2021 and it will end in March 2024. I think throughout this project, we've acknowledged that we are not the first or the last to probably do research on how funding moves within any sector in Canada. But for this project in particular, the research deliverables, we were tasked to look at an environmental scan report, model making, and then to develop the community-based funding model report and evaluation. The environmental scan report was led by Social Planning Toronto and includes a synthesis of service gaps, census data, and literature review of community-based funding models. And this work was completed between November 2021 and May 2023. And I'm not going to go through all the research activities, but I will highlight one aspect that demonstrates how we integrated an equity-based co-design approach to our research. In June and July 2022, we held a series of focus groups with newcomers to further understand service gaps within the sector. And we targeted our outreach to newcomers who were unconnected from services. We were able to conduct 12 focus groups, reaching a total of 81 newcomers, 35 of who identified themselves as unconnected from typical and traditional settlement services. We were able to offer each participant $100 for their participation. And we were able to also offer participants the choice of attending an in-person or a virtual focus group. We were also able to offer them in several different languages. So we were able to offer focus groups in Mandarin, Arabic, Bengali, Dari, Tamil, Soniki, and one of our focus groups was specifically for LGBTQ plus identifying participants. This process reminded us that when we design the research to serve the needs of the participants, it takes significantly more time and care to do so. And this coordination undertaking was led by our project coordinator at the time, Badranasha. And if you'd like to read more about our environmental scan work, you can read the fabulous and detailed, i.e. long, report written by Sharma from SPT. And as we go through this session, I'm going to elaborate more specifically on the model making process more shortly. And of course, our final report will summarize everything, including this session and what we've learned so far, and will be available to the public in April 2024. And really, this project is not just about the 3 partners that Paulina mentioned before, and this project is not possible without our project advisory and our participants and our co-design cohort. So through this project, we've had a project advisory who we met with to guide our project as well as to offer insights on what's happening within the sector. The project advisory evolved several times and we engaged more and more participants as we went, and it was intentionally designed to center the voices of newcomers and racialized leaders throughout. We engaged with hundreds of newcomers and service providers throughout this research, many of them who attended several research activities and are also here today. And our aim throughout the research project was to ensure that newcomers were compensated for their participation and their wisdom was always valued. For the model making phase, we launched a co-design cohort to intentionally engage with a group of stakeholders for a sustained commitment to our research project. The cohort includes 7 newcomers from the Toronto South area who represent different demographic intersections. And each stakeholder who has engaged with us through our research project shared their time and their wisdom with us, which has ultimately shaped our research findings around service gaps, funding, the proposed model, as well as how to engage in multiple forms of evaluation and feedback throughout the project. So I've mentioned a couple times that we used a co-designed approach. And so there are many, many different kinds of co-design approaches, and the principles are kind of simple. They're about sharing power, prioritizing relationships, building capacity and capability, and using participatory means. This is, of course, easier said than done, and it takes time and commitment from multiple stakeholders. This is not something that could have been done in this project if one of our project partners wasn't on board or one of our advisory wasn't on board. And so we actually needed that ongoing commitment throughout the project. With every research activity we designed and implemented, we were constantly thinking about the varying levels of knowledge people were bringing with them, the ways that people would feel most comfortable sharing, the responsibility we had to share decision-making wherever possible, and the time we took to share stories and to just get to know each other, and how we were able to create shared ownership of the process. This approach served as the research methodology for this project, as well as proof of concept around readiness from the newcomer serving sector to engage in this way in a system-level decision-making process. Through this implementation, we were able to document and learn from ongoing evaluation and reflection from participants, including what works and doesn't work. Today's model is an outcome of this process. So as a result, our proposed model is rooted in equity and co-design with a focus on what is needed to reinforce strong relational infrastructure. This model builds in specific mechanisms around shared decision-making, transparent and accessible evaluation data, coordinated efforts to minimize system and service gaps. And the model's design seeks to address issues of inequity and marginalized stakeholders, including newcomers, racialized leaders of small and grassroots organizations. Okay, so in order to design this proposed model, we took guidance from the environmental scan research and report and built on that foundation to get to the model making phase. This project is not the first project to embed co-design principles, and so we sought out others who've done so before. I interviewed 11 stakeholders who've led co-design projects with newcomers in the newcomer serving sector or in Toronto in order to frame the model making phase. And as we moved in through the model making phase, we prioritized participation from newcomers and racialized leaders. And the co-design cohort, like I mentioned, was created as a way to sustain engagement and a role for newcomers to inform the model. In order to co-design our model, we knew that we needed to build capacity from the rich research that was conducted in the environmental scan in a way that was accessible. While everyone loves a 118-page report, it's not always everyone's best way of absorbing content. And so we had 4 learning sessions to foster shared learning and curiosity around data, participatory funding, public policy and education, and collaborative governance. In these sessions, we heard from SPTs, researchers, as well as subject matter experts in each area, and we were able to offer time for facilitated discussion for newcomers and service providers to ask questions alongside our research team. This helped us to understand where knowledge about each of these topics were and where to focus our attention during our model making session. We held 3 model making sessions in December, 2 in person and 3 virtually. And during these model making sessions, we focused on discussions on 2 specific funding models to gather feedback from stakeholders. The first model we shared is a participatory funding model. I'm not going to go super in depth into this, but I will give you the high levels. We chose this specific model because it highlighted funding mechanisms designed to shift decision-making away from the funder and towards a people's panel with the support and facilitation of an intermediary. Our key takeaways from this model is that how the funding is distributed and to which organizations, as well as the role of the intermediary functioned in this model. And if you're interested, I will never say enough about reading the environmental scan, or you can also learn directly from Tamarack Institute or West Foundation, who were a part of this model. The second model we shared is a collaborative governance model. We chose this specific model because it highlighted a goal towards coordinated service delivery with integration of multiple service providers into a community advisory board facilitated by an intermediary. It is also a federal funding model that is currently being implemented. And our key takeaways from this model are the specific mechanisms designed to integrate lived and professional experiences through the caucuses and the participation of government stakeholders in the Community Advisory Board. And again, if you're interested in learning more about this, you can read our environmental scan, or you can learn more about it by looking up Reaching Home, Canada's Homelessness Strategy. And so before we present to you our proposed model, we wanted to share with you what we heard from participants from our model making sessions. Roles can change. Newcomers have power too. They have the right and the capacity. In the first moment, they are at a disadvantage, but the system has to be built to change the situation. If not, the system does not work. They are not burdens. When they're sitting at the table, they should be equal. This is wisdom that we heard from a newcomer in one of our model making sessions. We also heard from newcomers that we heard a continued request to listen to newcomers directly about service gaps and needs by designing multiple ways to make participating and offering feedback accessible, such as focus groups, interviews, surveys, consultations that are all designed to meet newcomers where they are and in whatever language they are most comfortable speaking. We also heard a desire from newcomers, for some, to have a more direct and integrated role in decision-making that recognizes the strengths newcomers bring to service delivery and development. We heard about how proposed service improvement changes based on who's involved in decision-making and a need to acknowledge there are a lot of different perspectives and priorities that newcomers bring, and that might influence the type of decisions that they want to spearhead. If frontline service providers were consulted from the beginning, there would not have been these gaps in the first place. We heard this from our learning session subject matter expert, and we heard from service providers a desire for increased transparency and trust when communicating with funders, especially around funding priorities and requirements. We heard a desire for outcomes-focused measurements and making reporting metrics that are more relevant and flexible to allow for responsiveness around service changes and on-the-ground implementation. We heard a request to decrease the feeling of punitive funding, especially around a fear of losing funding that drives evaluation and hinders innovation in program and service delivery. We heard a need for increased resources and mechanisms to support collaboration, and a recognition that collaboration is valuable, but may require more funds and time to implement effectively. And we heard a push for more opportunities for innovation and calculated risk-taking aimed at service improvements while creating a culture of shared learning and feedback. We create our organizations because of the failings of the current laws, policies, and structures. Then we need access to financial resources because the need for our organization is apparent and real. But we face barriers to access and are expected to change the work we do. Communities should decide for ourselves where our money goes. We heard this specifically from grassroots leaders in one of our model making sessions. We heard from grassroots leaders a desire for two-way communication following consultations and decisions on funding projects, especially how input was used or not used. We heard a need to value the ongoing contributions and connections that grassroots leaders bring to the sector that is unique from large service providers. We heard a request to share power and decision-making around funding and service delivery. We heard a need for additional investments and capacity building, going directly to grassroots leaders and organizations to grow their individual and collective capacity to engage further. And we heard a need to foster innovation at the grassroots level and a model that leaves space for responsiveness and fresh ideas to be tested and prototyped. So while each stakeholder group brings forward distinct positions, perspectives, and considerations, we also heard additional overlapping themes that are intersecting between all the stakeholder groups. We heard a need for a tailored approach and flexibility in funding that can address specific needs or a different newcomer group, potentially based on a geographic or demographic need. We heard a request for feedback mechanisms designed to be responsive and to support shared data and learning within the sector to evaluate collective gaps and to improve the funding process on an ongoing basis. We heard a need to decrease the complexity of the application and reporting processes to increase accessibility and to minimize the stress and labor that might exclude smaller and grassroots organizations. And we heard a desire for increased training and opportunities for relationship building between the funder and fund recipients for ease of communication and understanding of change requests. And we heard a need to address competition between service providers in order to have a more coordinated service delivery. And then we heard a lot of feedback specifically about the role of the intermediary. Each stakeholder group shared their varied experiences when it comes to intermediaries, especially those who have been in a financial or administrative trustee role. And we heard about the importance of trust and accountability that's needed from the intermediary to be able to serve the sector, especially in order to facilitate a healthy relationship between funder and fund recipients. Alongside trust and accountability, we heard a need for equity and transparency in how the intermediary is selected and is suitable for the role of managing multiple stakeholder relationships and skilled in conflict resolution and power sharing. We heard a range of skills and knowledge needed from the intermediary, including evaluation, community-based research, data analysis, facilitation, conflict mediation, and service delivery and sector knowledge. Okay, so now taking all of this into consideration, we developed a proposed model that we think attempts to address all that we heard. Our proposed funding model aims to establish equitable relational infrastructure between and within service delivery by integrating newcomers, grassroots leaders, and service providers into a community advisory board that is supported and facilitated by an intermediary with direct feedback mechanisms throughout fund development, distribution, and completion. The model design seeks to build a more effective and equitable process into funding decisions before and after the contribution process. Our proposed funding model, for this model, we've imagined an application on a limited fund designed for a specific stream previously identified by the funder, focused on service delivery within Toronto South, where the primary contribution comes from IRCC. Here it is. Our proposed model introduces two new stakeholder entities. Our model includes a community advisory board and an intermediary. So we're proposing a community advisory board that is composed of newcomers, grassroots leaders, and service providers. And we're proposing that that commitment and terms of the community advisory board is separated into two major roles and responsibilities. The first CAB is initiated for the fund development phase of the work. And the role of that CAB, a role on that CAB, is paid and open to all stakeholders, including organizations who may eventually apply for this specific fund. The second CAB is initiated for the fund distribution and post-funding contribution phase of the work. Newcomer roles on the CAB continue to be paid, and grassroots and service provider roles would be filled by recipients of the fund, who are then compensated through their funding agreement. The second CAB will have the opportunity to form working groups. Those working groups are designated for focused group discussions around specific topics and issues raised by CAB members. Working groups are intended to encourage dialogue outside of the mixed stakeholder groups and between peers. So for example, specifically for newcomers to talk to newcomers, grassroots leaders to talk to grassroots leaders, and service providers to talk to service providers. Both CABs would be working directly with the intermediary. The intermediary is a paid facilitator and coordinating entity who is not a direct service provider in the sector. The intermediary facilitates communication and documentation between the CAB and the funder, and mediates and supports the CAB in communicating funding and evaluation expectations to the funder, and holds the funder accountable to recommendations made by the CAB. The intermediary does not manage any fund distribution to the CABs. The intermediary, like I said, requires skills and knowledge in evaluation, community-based research, data analysis, facilitation, partnership brokering, conflict mediation, with a specific focus on equity, anti-oppression, and anti-racism. The intermediary will work directly with the LIP and the umbrella organizations to gather sector knowledge, and directly with the funder to gather fund parameters and policy information. And the intermediary may seek evaluation support externally if needed. The intermediary will coordinate capacity building sessions for the working groups. CAB and funders are there as needed to support the effective implementation of the funding model. The funder will be responsible for making funding decisions based on the recommendations on funding criteria and application process put forward by the CAB. The funder will be responsible for distributing funds directly to fund recipients and holding agreements, much like the current process. And the funder will be responsible for sharing updated information with the intermediary and CAB as it affects and is related to the fund, as well as being available on request from the CAB to explain changes, limitations, and federal regulations. The funder is responsible for communicating how recommendations have been integrated, and if not implemented, the rationale for why not. The funder is responsible for participating in meetings requested by the CAB and facilitated by the intermediary to respond to system gaps identified by CAB members. So for programming issues, this might involve program managers or officers and managers, or for systemic or policy issues that might involve policy and operations staff. If this process is initiated, the intermediary is responsible for documenting the process and any changes that are made as a result of that process. So how does this all work? There are essentially 3 distinct phases in this proposed funding model. Like I mentioned, one would be initiated for fund development, one is for fund distribution and service delivery, and there's one that's for post-funding contribution. So during the fund development, the intermediary works with the CAB to make recommendations to the application criteria, process, and evaluation indicators. The intermediary will develop an equity-based rubric with input from the LIP and the funder to determine eligibility of CAB members based on current service gaps and local demographics. In this phase, the intermediary is especially mindful of how participation is designed and accessible for all stakeholders in order to minimize power dynamics and to optimize equity. The funder will have representatives available to answer questions around funding priorities and restrictions. Together, all stakeholders will contribute and sign off on a shared terms of reference and accountability agreement. And during the fund distribution, the intermediary works with the CAB to create an environment for shared learning and coordinated service delivery. The intermediary is responsible for coordinating, facilitating, and documenting all CAB meetings and sharing learnings to the sector and to the funder. The intermediary will develop funding mechanisms for CAB members and fund recipients to anonymously share service delivery gaps, including things like wait times, service limitations, changes to clients' needs, inability to meet proposed targets, in order to eliminate who's putting forward a gap in order for it to be addressed. Ultimately, the aim is to foster a more collaborative environment and to minimize competition between service providers. In order to address systems gaps during the fund distribution phase, the CAB and the intermediary will co-design a protocol for raising collective issues to the funder and during the funding cycle. This protocol may result in amendments to the funding agreements or seek additional funding from other funders. This is dependent on the capacity and the interest of the CAB. During the post-fund contribution, the CAB and intermediary reflect on all the overall impacts of the funding process and implementation in order to inform the incoming fund development CAB. The intermediary is responsible for documenting and sharing the results of the funding model and making recommendations for further implementation. The intermediary may seek at this time external evaluators for this phase. So this proposed model requires foresight and imagination with a commitment to relationship building and evaluation. In order to embed equitable practices throughout the process, the selection of the intermediary to oversee this process is critical. The intermediary will be selected in partnership between the LIP and the funder to ensure accountability and transparency. Together, the funder, the LIP, and the intermediary would establish a rubric for that targeted recruitment for CAB membership that is a mix of newcomers, grassroots leaders, and service providers, which prioritizes multiple intersections from equity-deserving communities, including racialized people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, persons with disabilities, people with mental illness, and members of the 2S LGBTQIA+ persons. Selection and onboarding of the CAB members would be led by the intermediary with support from the LIP and the funder as needed. Capacity building sessions would be taking place as needed and initiated prior to working on the fund development. The intermediary would host a minimum of 2 CAB meetings during the fund development phase. And this process of recruitment, selection, onboarding, and capacity building would require 2 years of time ahead of fund distribution. The proposed timeline for the fund development phase is 1 year prior to the fund distribution phase. And then successful applicants would be invited to participate in the second CAB to share learning and feedback between fund recipients and the funder. And the commitment to the second CAB is aligned to the 5-year service delivery model. So in order to inform the next funding cycle, a new CAB would be initiated 2 years prior to the launch of that next funding cycle and overlaps with those previous successful fund recipients in order to offer opportunities for shared learning. And as you can see, evaluation and learning show up throughout this proposed funding model as a way to be responsive to systems gaps and service delivery. The primary goal of investing in ongoing and deliberate evaluation in this funding model is to create shared accountability for the implementation and effectiveness of a proposed funding model. The proposed model requires investment in relational infrastructure to create a trusting, transparent, and reciprocal funding relationship. So in order to make this model possible, financial investment and commitment to relational infrastructure are needed. Relational infrastructure refers to the social connections, interactions, and collective intelligence that underpin a community, a network, or a group's ability to collaborate, solve problems, and drive change. It's an emergent framework of trust, shared values, and common goals that allow individuals, groups, and organizations to work together effectively, to pool their resources if necessary, and to amplify their impact. A strong relational infrastructure can enable organizations and communities to overcome challenges, build resilience, and create sustainable social, economic, and environmental value and outcomes. And this includes, but is not limited to, a contract and funding allocated to the role of the intermediary to be available to facilitate, document, and maintain relationships, funds allocated to the participation of all CAB members, and capacity building being offered and paid for to the individuals participating in the CAB, as well as to the fund recipients and to the funder as needed. Okay. That's a lot. But really, in order to make this possible, we really need to know what you think.
And I'm
So,
just going to jump in
yes,
for 1 second and reiterate to everybody that while the presentation will be publicly available, this part of the session will not be. So we are still recording it because we need it for research purposes, but anything that's used in research will be anonymized, and this is not going to be publicly available.
thanks for that confirmation, Paulina. But with that said, I know I said a lot. But basically, like Paulina said, moving forward, everything is open for discussion.